Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So if you want to build a skyscraper today, you basically need a mountain of paperwork.
Oh, absolutely. A literal mountain.
Right, like you had to submit architectural blueprints, engineering schematics, zoning permits, environmental impact reports. I mean, every single load-bearing beam and steel rivet is recorded on a digital file, or at least a physical schematic, before a shovel even touches the dirt.
Yeah, and the reason we do that is totally visible record of intention. It's a literal paper trail that guarantees everyone from the lead architect all the way down to the construction worker is operating from the exact same structural logic.
Exactly. But what if you wanted to build an empire? And not just any empire, but an empire covering roughly 1.24 million square kilometers.
Which is, just to put it in perspective, that's just about the size of modern-day Western Europe.
Right. It's massive. An empire that controlled up to 2/3 of the gold circulating in the entire medieval world. An empire fielding standing armies of 100,000 men, managing this incredibly complex, multi-ethnic population. And what if you had to do all that and sustain it for literally centuries, almost entirely, without writing a single foundational document down?
I mean, you're describing a fundamentally different paradigm of statecraft there. You are entirely replacing the physical archive with, well, with disciplined human memory.
And that is exactly what we're looking at today. We are taking a deep dive into the Mali Empire. This is the vast West African state that dominated the region from the 13th to the 17th centuries. It stretched all the way from the Atlantic coast, straight across the Sahel, encompassing parts of, modern Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea, Mali, and Niger. It was just a geopolitical behemoth.
A total behemoth, yeah.
And to really understand how a small Mandinka kingdom scaled up to that kind of magnitude, we have to pull from a really diverse stack of sources for this deep dive.
We do, yeah, because we have to essentially triangulate the history. So on one side, we have external written accounts from medieval Arab chroniclers and travelers.
Men like Ibn Battuta and al-Lamari.
Exactly. And their observations are invaluable for us. They provide hard dates, economic figures, detailed descriptions, though, of course, we always have to filter their accounts through their specific cultural and religious lenses.
Right, because they're outsiders looking in.
Right. And then we have the archaeological record, so the material evidence of their urban centers, their iron smelting furnaces, the trade goods that were left behind.
But critically, we also have the internal perspective.
Yes, the oral traditions.
These were meticulously preserved and transmitted across centuries by the griots or Jelly. These are the hereditary historians and the masters of speech in West Africa. And our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize all of this. We really want to unpack the actual mechanics of this empire. Like, how did they enforce their laws? How did they manage an economy that was almost entirely based on gold and salt?
And, how did their military actually function on the ground?
Exactly. So to get to the absolute height of their power, we have to start at the foundation. Because you cannot construct an empire of that sheer scale without a very specific set of geopolitical conditions allowing it to rise in the first place.
Right. You need a massive disruption to the existing order.
You essentially need the previous landlord to get evicted.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Prior to Mali taking over, the dominant power in the West African savannah was the Ouagadougou. Most outsiders refer to it as the Ghana Empire.
Right.
But by the late 11th century, Ouagadougou had structurally collapsed.
And that decline of Ouagadougou just fractured the entire region. I mean, the trans-Saharan trade routes, these massive arteries of wealth moving gold north and salt south, they were still there.
So functioning, yeah.
But the central authority that was taxing and protecting them was just gone. So this creates a deeply volatile landscape. You suddenly had dozens of smaller chiefdoms and kingdoms engaging in this really violent scramble to control those lucrative trade bottlenecks.
And out of that highly fractured landscape, one kingdom manages to temporarily seize the upper hand, and that is the Soso Kingdom. By the early 13th century, under a highly aggressive king named Sumaro Kante.
Who the oral traditions often refer to as Sumaguru.
Right, exactly. Under him, the Soso established total regional hegemony. And Sumaro, well, he does not rule with a light touch.
No, he really doesn't. He completely subjugates the neighboring Mandinka people. He levies these crippling taxes and systematically crushes any kind of localized political autonomy.
The historical traditions paint a very dark picture of his reign. He is characterized not just as a military tyrant, but as a ruler who actively utilized terror and sorcery to maintain his control. I mean, he would reportedly raid his own vassals just for captives and
This is
resources.
incredibly destabilizing.
Highly destabilizing. And this intense, oppressive environment is basically the pressure cooker that ultimately produces the founder of the Mali Empire.
Sundiata Keita, the Lion Prince.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's unpack Sundiata a bit, because his origin story is so central to understanding how the empire was ultimately governed later on. So he is born around 1190, and the sources really emphasize that his early life was defined by extreme vulnerability.
Yes. The Greek traditions state that he was physically debilitated, he was entirely unable to walk until the age of 7,
Right.
and whether we interpret that physical inability literally or view it as a powerful metaphor for the delayed ascendance of the Mandinka people themselves, the outcome is the same. He was marginalized.
And that marginalization just compounded when his father, who was a local Mandinka ruler, passed away, because that is when the political persecution really kicks into high gear.
It does.
Sundiata's stepmother, Sasuma Barete, she basically seizes control of the court to install her own son. She views Sundiata and his mother as a lingering threat, and she makes their lives so utterly hostile that Sundiata is just forced into exile. And this isn't, a brief vacation. He is banished for roughly 20 years.
And that 2-decade exile is the defining period of his entire life. He is essentially this royal fugitive, moving constantly across the really harsh terrain of the Sahel. He spends time in the courts of neighboring realms, notably in Ouagadougou and the Kingdom of Mema.
Which, when you look at it, operates like a masterclass in regional geopolitics.
Yeah.
He isn't just out there surviving, he's studying.
He's observing everything.
Right. It really reminds me of a modern political exile who gets pushed out of their home country, but instead of just fading into obscurity, they use their time abroad to build a massive, decentralized resistance movement. Sundiata is out there learning cavalry tactics from the Northerners. He's studying different systems of governance.
And critically, he is forging personal relationships with various Sahelian groups. He is actively building an intersectional coalition.
Yeah.
He connects with Fulani herders, various disgruntled Mandinka clans, the leadership of Mema, essentially anyone who has a vested interest in seeing the Soso hegemony dismantled.
He gives them a common enemy.
Exactly. He cultivates a shared identity based on mutual resistance to Sumuro Kante.
So around 1234, the situation back home reaches a breaking point. A delegation of Mandinka elders actually tracks Sundiata down and essentially begs him to return and lead a unified revolt.
And he accepts.
He marches back toward his homeland with this highly diverse, carefully constructed coalition army.
And the defining confrontation happens in 1235 at the Battle of Quirina. This is where Sundiata's forces, which are this combination of troops from northern and southern Mandan, along with heavily armed cavalry from his allies in Mema, they finally face the main bulk of the Soso army.
Now, the oral traditions feature a very specific, deeply symbolic narrative detail regarding this battle. They say Sundiata utilized a magical arrow tipped with the spur of a white rooster to graze Sumaro.
Right, the White Rooster spur.
Yeah, and this supposedly neutralized Sumaro's magical defenses, causing him to flee and just mysteriously vanish from the battlefield, which completely shatters the morale of his troops.
And that narrative element is a really profound way of recording the shift in spiritual and political legitimacy. The White Rooster spur represents a specific type of localized spiritual authority, overcoming the oppressive sorcery attributed to Sumaro.
Right.
But if we analyze the battle through a strict military framework, Sundiata's victory was actually a masterstroke of tactical organization.
Because obviously magic arrows don't coordinate flank attacks.
Precisely. Sundiata leveraged the heavy cavalry units he acquired during his exile to execute a devastating tactical encirclement. Furthermore, he heavily exploited pre-existing fractures within the Soso ranks.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, all that diplomatic groundwork he did during his exile, it paid off. It led to critical alliance betrayals by Sumaro's own generals. Right in the middle of the conflict, the entire Soso command structure just collapsed under the pressure.
Wow, I mean, that's just a striking failure of leadership on Samaro's part. So Samaro was defeated, the Soso power is broken, Sundiata is universally declared Mansa, which means emperor or king of kings.
King of Kings, yes.
He has successfully unified the fractured Mandinka clans and conquered his oppressor. But, holding a coalition together during a war is infinitely easier than holding it together during peacetime.
Oh, absolutely.
Because once the common enemy is gone, what stops these heavily armed, formerly rival factions from immediately turning on each other to fight over the spoils.
And that is the ultimate test of statecraft. To transition from a successful warlord to a functioning emperor, Sundiata had to immediately replace the momentum of the military campaign with a rigid, universally accepted legal structure. He had to build the civic architecture.
And he does this almost immediately after the battle. In 1236, he gathers his allied generals, the clan elders, and the griots at this massive clearing near the town of Kaaba. And this assembly produces the Kurukan Fuga.
The Mandan Charter.
Right. It is an oral constitution. And the level of granularity in this document is just striking.
It is. Through the meticulous preservation of the griot lineages, we know the Kurukan Fuga consisted of 44 specific edicts. It did not rely on vague philosophical declarations. It outlined highly specific regulations.
Yeah. They categorize them into social organization, property rights, environmental conservation, and personal obligations to the state.
They're very comprehensive.
So let's slow down and look at the actual mechanics of the government it established, because they introduce a lot of highly specific terminology that forms the real engine of the empire. It starts with the creation of the Jubara, the Great Assembly.
So the Jubara functioned as the primary deliberative and legislative body of the empire. It was originally composed of 29 seats, though it was later expanded to 32 in subsequent generations.
And then these seats weren't randomly assigned, right?
No, not at all. They were strictly allocated to specific family lineages and clans. It represented a very calculated balance of power.
The division of those seats is just a fascinating look at what they valued as a society. You have the 16 Jontan Owuro. That translates roughly to the quiver carriers.
Right, the military clans.
Exactly. These were the clans that provided the military leadership and defense for the empire. So they held the majority of the physical force. But they didn't rule unchecked, which is key. You also had 4 seats dedicated to the Morkandalulu.
And those were the guardians of the Islamic faith. Even at this early stage in the empire, integrating the Islamic clerics and jurists into the highest deliberative body was absolutely crucial.
Why was that so important so early on?
Because they advised the Mansa and the military leaders on religious law, diplomacy with the North African states, and complex legal disputes. They were the administrative bridge to the broader Islamic world.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Then you had 4 seats assigned to the Nyamakala, and this is where the social engineering gets really complex. The Nyamakala were the specialized occupational castes.
Yes.
These were entire lineages holding absolute monopolies over specific trades. So the blacksmiths who smelted iron, the leather workers, the boat builders.
To really understand the Nyamakala, you have to understand the underlying concept of Nyama. In the traditional Mandinka worldview, Nyama is a highly potent, animating, spiritual energy that is present in the natural world.
Right.
It is powerful, and it is highly dangerous if mishandled.
Almost like handling raw radiation.
Yeah.
Like you need a specialized hazmat suit.
That is a highly accurate analogy, actually. Smelting iron ore into a weapon, or even carving wood from a sacred tree, was believed to release massive amounts of Nyama. So the artisans of the Nyamakala castes were viewed as the only individuals who possessed the hereditary spiritual fortitude and the specialized knowledge to manipulate these materials safely.
Without bringing disaster upon the community.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. And then rounding out the assembly, you had 4 clans of Jelly, the griots.
The masters of speech.
Right. They were the official historians, the diplomats. They were the ones who actually memorized and codified everything happening in the Kurukan Fuga.
And this functional division at the very top mirrored the broader social hierarchy of the entire empire. At the apex, of course, was the Mansa and his royal lineage.
Sure.
Below them were the Haran, which made up the vast majority of the population. These were the freeborn nobles, the agriculturalists, essentially the people forming the economic baseline and the bulk of the infantry.
And below the Haran were the Nyamakala artisans we just discussed. And at the bottom of the social strata were the Jan, or enslaved people.
And we must be very precise about the nature of this institution here.
Right. It's not what people typically picture.
No. Slavery in the Mali Empire was primarily driven by warfare, with captives taken from the peripheries of the empire. While they were heavily utilized in agricultural labor on royal estates, and also in the military, it differed structurally from the later transatlantic chattel slavery system.
In what ways?
Well, the Jana often held specific rights under the Kurukan Fuga. They could sometimes own property, and over successive generations, their descendants were frequently integrated into the broader societal kinship networks. It was a more porous boundary over time.
The edicts also engineered these very specific behavioral mechanisms to prevent all these rigid social layers from just grinding against each other and sparking a civil war.
Yes.
And one of the most compelling of these is the Senankuya, or the joking relationship.
The Sundiata is just a brilliant piece of social technology. It formally established a codified system of mutual teasing, obligatory hospitality, and non-aggression between specific clans or ethnic groups.
So it basically operates like an institutionalized mandatory
A
roast.
roast, yeah.
Like if a member of Clan A accidentally tramples the crops of Clan B, instead of immediately drawing swords and starting a multi-generational blood feud, they are culturally obligated to ruthlessly make fun of each other's heritage until the tension diffuses.
Exactly. It functioned as an invaluable pressure valve for the society. It forced adversaries to interact through humor and formalized insults rather than violence, which maintained social equilibrium across what was a highly diverse population.
The Constitution was also remarkably forward-thinking regarding specific rights. I mean, Edict 16 explicitly mandates that women must be represented and consulted at all levels of government. There are edicts strictly banning the maltreatment of prisoners.
It was very comprehensive.
But looking at the core economic structure for a second, assigning specific, inescapable trades to specific lineages through the Nyamakala system. If you are born a farmer, you die a farmer. You can never become a blacksmith, no matter how much aptitude you show. Doesn't that rigid caste system fundamentally throttle economic innovation?
If you analyze it through the lens of a modern free market economy that prioritizes individual mobility, yes, it appears very restrictive. But in the context of a rapidly expanding 13th century empire, the goal was not individual innovation. The goal was systemic stability. Hereditary specialization engineered a system of absolute economic monopolies.
Oh, I see the mechanism. So Clan A never decides to declare war on Clan B to take over the local iron market because Clan A is not legally or spiritually permitted to smell iron in the first place.
Precisely. It completely eliminated inter-clan economic competition, and economic competition is the primary driver of civil conflict.
That makes total sense.
It forced mutual reliance. The agricultural clans needed the blacksmiths for hoes and spear points. The blacksmiths relied entirely on the farmers for their food supply. Everyone relied on the griots to mediate their disputes. It wove this tight tapestry of enforced interdependence. If you pull one thread, the whole society starves.
So they basically engineered a society where civil war was economically impossible because no single clan controlled a complete supply chain. That is brilliant.
It was highly effective.
And this philosophy extended to how they managed the territory itself, right? They operated as a segmentary federation.
Yes. Sundiata did not attempt to build a monolithic, rigidly centralized bureaucracy. He knew that trying to micromanage the daily affairs of distant territories all the way from his capital at Nyani would be a logistical nightmare.
Of course.
So the Mansa ruled the core Mandan heartland directly. But for the peripheral regions, like the newly conquered Ouagadougou, or Mema, he often allowed the existing local kings to remain in power.
So he just co-ops the local leadership.
Exactly. As long as those regional kings paid their annual tribute, acknowledged the ultimate supremacy of the Mansa, and provided levies for the military when called upon, they were largely left alone to manage their own local affairs.
But how did he make sure they actually did that?
To ensure compliance, the Mansa would appoint officials known as Farba, or Fari, to serve as provincial governors or royal overseers in these peripheral zones. They operated as the eyes and ears of the central government, ensuring the tribute flowed and the trade routes remained open.
Okay, so Sundiata has this brilliant oral constitution that balances power on paper. But, an agreement spoken out loud doesn't stop a raid by Tuareg nomads, and it doesn't suppress a localized rebellion.
No, it does not.
If you have an empire the size of Western Europe, you can't rely entirely on an intricate web of politeness and joking relationships. How do they actually enforce a monopoly on violence across that much land?
They enforced it through a military apparatus that was truly staggering in its scale and its logistical complexity. At the height of the empire, historical accounts consistently report that Mali maintained a standing, mobilized army of roughly 100,000 troops.
100,000 men.
Yes. And within that massive force, the absolute elite, the tip of the spear, was the cavalry. The sources indicate a dedicated force of 10,000 mounted soldiers. These were the Mandekalu horsemen, and they were commanded by officers known as the Tontigi, or the quiver masters.
Okay, but the cavalry was the premier striking force. But wasn't it also a massive economic vulnerability? Because West Africa does not possess a natural climate conducive to large-scale horse breeding.
No, it doesn't. Not at all. The empire had to import Barbary horses from North Africa, bringing them all the way across the grueling trans-Saharan trade routes.
Let's do the math on that because the logistics are just terrifying. The sources note that a single imported Barbary horse could cost between 10 and 20 gold myth walls.
Which is a fortune.
That is roughly the equivalent of a skilled laborer's entire annual wage. Just to purchase a force of 10,000 horses, you are expending a mountain of national wealth. But then you factor in the geography.
The environmental constraint is severe. As you move south from the arid Sahel into the humid, forested savanna regions of the empire, you encounter the tsetse fly,
Which carries a disease called trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, which is highly lethal to horses.
It's extremely lethal. The mortality rate for these astronomically expensive imported horses when they were deployed in the southern humid zones could exceed 50% in a single year.
So they are essentially burning mountains of cash just to keep these animals on the field. They're placing half their inventory annually. How does the state justify that kind of burn rate? Why not just use infantry?
Because the tactical advantage of heavy cavalry on the open flatlands of the Sahel was absolute.
Okay.
These weren't lightly armed scouts. The cavalrymen were equipped with imported chainmail hauberks, iron helmets, long lances. When deployed effectively, a synchronized charge by heavily armored cavalry could shatter an enemy infantry line in minutes.
It's the shock and awe factor.
Completely. It provided rapid mobility to patrol the sprawling trade routes and the shock power to crush rebellions instantly.
But because the cavalry was so fragile and expensive, they had to be deployed with extreme care, primarily keeping them in the drier northern zones, which means the vast majority of the actual fighting and holding of territory fell to the infantry.
Yes. The infantry formed the undeniable backbone of the Malian military structure. These 90,000 foot soldiers were organized under regional commanders known as Kelekun. And this is where that Nyamakala caste system we discussed earlier, specifically the Numu, the blacksmiths, provided a massive strategic advantage.
Explain how the blacksmiths changed the math on the battlefield.
The Malian blacksmiths had mastered the use of local bloomery furnaces. These were clay structures used to smelt the abundant local iron ore.
And a bloomery furnace operates very differently than just tossing rocks into a campfire. You have to use continuous bellows to pump oxygen into the charcoal, raising the temperature high enough to liquefy the impurities while leaving behind a spongy mass of pure iron called a bloom. It requires immense specialized skill.
Exactly. And because the Numu had a strict monopoly on this highly refined technique, they could consistently produce high-quality iron weaponry at scale. They supplied the infantry with iron-tipped spears, short swords, iron arrowheads. Consider the tactical disparity here. Many of the smaller chiefdoms or nomadic raiders that Mali encountered early in its expansion were still heavily reliant on weapons tipped with sharpened bone, stone, or just fire-hardened wood.
And an iron spear point is going to punch right through a wooden shield. The material advantage is just overwhelming. Add to that the infantry's extensive use of composite bows firing poisoned arrows, and you have a highly lethal force.
When you look at how they deploy these units together, it reveals a highly sophisticated command structure. They divided the military administration into two massive geographical theaters.
Right. You had the Ferem Sura. That was the general tasked with securing the northern borders against the constant threat of Saharan nomads.
Yeah.
And you had the Sankurzuma, the commander overseeing the southern riverine territories and the gold-producing regions.
And here's the crucial detail regarding those two supreme commanders. They reported directly and only to the Mansa in the capital. They completely bypassed the local provincial governors.
Oh, wow. I mean, so if a regional king gets ambitious and decides to hold back his tax payments, he can't suddenly commandeer the local military garrison to defend himself because those troops answer to a general who answers only to the emperor.
Precisely. It centralizes the ultimate monopoly on violence.
And the deployment of the troops themselves also looks remarkably like modern combined arms doctrine.
The tactical synergy was very effective. The massive iron-equipped infantry acted as the anvil. They would engage the enemy line, hold them in place, and absorb the initial shock. Meanwhile, the heavy cavalry acted as the hammer.
Right, utilizing their speed.
Exactly, sweeping around the flanks and delivering a crushing blow to the enemy's exposed sides or rear.
It is a devastating combination. But it brings us back to a fundamental problem here. Maintaining an army of 100,000 men, continuously outfitting them with freshly smelted iron, and importing thousands of horses that die off at a 50% annual rate. The overhead costs of this empire are astronomical.
Yeah.
How do they avoid immediate bankruptcy?
Well, they financed this massive state apparatus by capitalizing on a geographical reality. Mali positioned itself as the mandatory toll booth over the resources that the rest of the medieval world desperately needed to function.
We have to talk about the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. This was the economic circulatory system of the era. It connected the Mediterranean economies of Europe and North Africa all the way down to the Gulf of Guinea.
It was a monumental undertaking.
The logistics of moving goods across this network are almost unfathomable.
Absolutely. Merchants in northern terminus cities like Sihel Massa in Morocco would assemble these massive camel caravans. We have records indicating that a single caravan could consist of anywhere from 1,000 to, in extreme cases, 10,000 camels.
Just imagine the sheer noise and chaos of organizing 10,000 camels.
It's incredible.
And they are embarking on a brutal 70-day journey across the deepest stretches of the Sahara Desert. They are moving maybe 20 miles a day, navigating by the stars, completely reliant on local Tuareg guides to find isolated oases. If a sandstorm hits or a well runs dry, the entire caravan and an immense fortune in goods simply vanishes into the dunes. What profit margin justifies that level of extreme risk?
Gold. The Islamic world and the burgeoning economies of medieval Europe required massive infusions of gold to mint their currencies and facilitate international trade. And the Mali Empire controlled the major source, the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure,
Which were located in the southern riverine regions of their territory.
Yes.
And the volume of output is staggering. Economic historians estimate that during its peak, the Mali Empire was the source of roughly two-thirds of all the gold circulating in the Mediterranean and Islamic world.
But the Mansas did not simply flood the market. They managed this resource with strict macroeconomic controls. By imperial decree, all solid gold nuggets extracted from the mines automatically belonged to the royal treasury.
So they hoarded the high-density wealth.
Yes, only gold dust was permitted to circulate within the empire's borders as a currency for merchants and commoners.
That's a really smart way to control inflation.
It is. This dual-track system allowed the state to concentrate the immense wealth required for international diplomacy and military funding while preventing localized hyperinflation that would destroy the domestic economy.
The actual mechanics of how this gold was traded with outsiders is one of the most compelling details in the sources. The Mandinka merchants utilized a practice called silent trade.
Yes.
They needed to sell the gold to the Berber and Arab middlemen coming down from the north, but they absolutely refused to reveal the geographical location of the Bambouk and Bure mines.
The security protocols were incredibly strict.
So the northern merchants would arrive at a designated riverbank, lay out their trade goods, beat a drum to signal their arrival, and then retreat miles away out of sight. The local gold miners would then emerge from the forest, inspect the goods, place a pile of gold dust next to the items they wanted, and retreat.
And then the northern merchants would return. If they felt the gold was a fair price, they took it and left. If not, they left the gold, retreated again, and waited for the miners to add more to the pile. This back and forth continued until a silent consensus was reached.
It is a brilliant system. They engage in massive international commerce without ever speaking a single word to the buyers.
Ensuring the secret locations of the mines remain completely uncompromised.
Right. But gold was only one side of the ledger. The primary commodity flowing south on those massive camel caravans, the good that was traded for the gold, was salt.
And to a modern observer, equating salt with gold seems absurd. But the value is driven by a harsh intersection of human biology and environmental scarcity.
Right. In the hot, intensely humid climates of the southern savanna, the human body loses critical amounts of sodium through constant sweating. Without dietary salt, you suffer severe muscle cramps, neurological issues, and eventually death. You also need salt to preserve meat and maintain the health of your livestock.
And the southern gold-producing regions had absolutely zero natural salt deposits. None. It had to be imported from the deep, arid north, specifically from desolate Saharan mining centers like Tagaza.
The traveler Ibn Battuta visited Tagaza, and his description is visceral. He describes a settlement with no trees, no agriculture, literally just sand and salt.
Yes, the houses and even the local mosque were constructed entirely out of solid blocks of mined salt, roofed with camel skins.
Which is wild. Enslaved laborers lived in brutal conditions there, digging massive slabs of salt out of the earth, loading them onto the camels, and sending them south.
And the extreme danger and massive logistical cost of transporting those heavy slabs across 70 days of desert inflated their value exponentially. By the time a slab of salt reached a southern market like Niani, it was so highly prized that it was routinely traded ounce for ounce for pure gold.
Now, here is where I have to push back on the economic strategy.
Sure.
If the Mansa commands a heavily armed military of 100,000 men, and he knows exactly where the gold fields are in his own territory, why rely on independent local miners to extract it? Why not march a few battalions of infantry down to Bure, occupy the mines, and use state labor to extract the gold directly? Maximize the profits.
Because occupying a resource is very different from successfully extracting it. The local miners, who were primarily traditional animists operating outside the Islamic structures of the urban centers, they possessed highly localized, specialized knowledge.
Right, they knew the land.
They knew how to read the alluvial plains, where to sink the deep shafts, and how to navigate the spiritual rituals required by their faith to ensure a good yield.
So if the central government sends in the military to occupy the shafts,
The miners simply drop their tools and flee deeper into the dense southern forests. The specialized labor force vanishes, and the gold flow abruptly halts. The Mansas recognized that direct, heavy-handed interference would destroy the very resource they were trying to exploit.
they realized it was infinitely more profitable to let the locals manage the extraction and instead position the state infrastructure at the transit bottlenecks.
Exactly. The empire operated on a massive taxation and transit model. They heavily taxed every ounce of copper moving south from Takeda. They taxed every slab of salt from Tagaza and every single load of ivory or kola nuts moving north.
They even managed a multi-tiered currency system to facilitate all this. While gold and salt handled the massive international transactions, the state imported millions of cowrie shells all the way from the Indian Ocean to serve as a stable, low-denomination currency for daily, localized market exchanges. It is a highly sophisticated, diversified economy.
It is. And by the early 14th century, the sheer volume of wealth pooling in the royal treasury at Niani was unprecedented. This vast accumulation of capital set the stage for a ruler who would project the power of Mali onto the global stage.
Mansa Musa I.
Yeah.
The ascension of Mansa Musa in 1312 is a fascinating story in its own right, largely because of how his predecessor exited the stage. Musa comes to power following the disappearance of Mansa Muhammad.
The account of Mansa Muhammad, as relayed later by Musa himself to scholars in Egypt, illustrates the immense ambition of the empire at that time. Muhammad was seemingly fixated on the Atlantic Ocean, convinced that it possessed a farther shore.
He wasn't content with dominating the land, he wanted to map the ocean. Musa recounted that Muhammad equipped a massive maritime expedition. Hundreds of vessels loaded with men, gold, water, and provisions meant to last for years.
And he sailed west into the Atlantic currents and was never seen again.
So Musa, who had been serving as his deputy, was formally elevated to the throne.
Musa inherited a structurally sound, economically dominant state. His genius was not necessarily in conquering new lands, but in utilizing the empire's vast wealth as an instrument of global diplomacy and cultural expansion.
And he achieved this primarily through his profound devotion to Islam, which culminates in 1324 when Mansa Musa embarks on the Hajj, the mandatory pilgrimage to Mecca.
And calling this a pilgrimage feels inadequate. It was a mobilization.
Yeah, the logistical scale of this caravan strains credulity. The eyewitness accounts recorded in Cairo by chroniclers like Al-Lamari describe a moving city. We were talking about tens of thousands of people.
Soldiers, merchants, scholars, and thousands of enslaved attendants.
The visual must have been staggering. The sources describe hundreds of heralds marching ahead, bearing staffs of pure, solid gold, and the baggage train carried roughly 18 tons of gold dust and nuggets.
And Musa did not hoard this wealth on the journey. He actively distributed it. As the caravan spent several months in Cairo, Musa bestowed lavish gold gifts upon the Mamluk Sultan and his officials. He gave alms to the poor.
He spent exorbitantly in the local markets, paying well above asking price for silks and goods.
He essentially dumps a massive stimulus package directly into the Egyptian economy. But he injects so much gold into circulation so rapidly that he completely crashes the market.
Right, he fundamentally devalued the currency. The sudden hyperabundance of gold caused its value against the silver dirham to plummet. The chroniclers note that the regional economy of Cairo, and by extension the broader Middle East, remained severely depressed for over a decade because of this single influx.
It is the ultimate flex of medieval soft power. He is broadcasting to the entire Islamic world and to the Mediterranean merchants watching from the sidelines. Mali possesses inexhaustible wealth, unshakable stability, and deep religious piety. Come trade with us.
And it worked. The geopolitical impact was permanent. We see the direct result of this soft power decades later in Europe. In 1375, a Jewish cartographer in Majorca produces the Catalan Atlas.
One of the most important maps of the medieval period.
Yes. And deep in the interior of West Africa, he draws a prominent illustration of a king universally understood to be Mansa Musa, wearing a golden crown, holding a massive gold nugget out toward a North African merchant riding a camel.
That map changes European foreign policy. Suddenly, every monarch and merchant in Europe is obsessed with finding the source of this West African gold.
But Musa wasn't just showing off. The goal of the Hajj was to bring the broader world back to Mali.
His return journey fundamentally altered the cultural trajectory of the empire. Musa actively recruited prominent Islamic scholars, jurists, poets, and highly skilled architects from Egypt and Andalusia.
He brings them back and begins aggressively transforming the urban centers. Cities like Timbuktu and Gao evolved from highly successful trade depots into internationally recognized hubs of Islamic scholarship.
He finances monumental public works, most famously bringing in the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili to design the Djingaribur Mosque in Timbuktu.
He also heavily invested in education, elevating the Sankore Madrasa in Timbuktu into a fully formalized, globally respected university system. The intellectual atmosphere attracted students from across the Islamic world. Over the subsequent centuries, it is estimated that the libraries of Timbuktu accumulated over 700,000 distinct manuscripts.
And these weren't just religious texts. These manuscripts covered advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, complex commercial law, and poetry.
But this deep integration of high-level Islamic scholarship presents a massive internal political challenge for Musa. How does he manage a state where the urban, trading elite are strict, Sharia-adherent Muslims, while the vast majority of the rural population, the farmers and the gold miners, are still deeply committed to traditional animist practices?
He manages it through a highly calculated syncretic approach to governance. Musa understood that forcing Orthodox Islam onto the rural populace would instantly trigger a massive rebellion and collapse the agricultural and mining sectors.
So he compartmentalizes the religion.
Precisely. Islam was utilized as a powerful tool for international diplomacy and urban administration. Implementing Sharia law in the cities was highly effective for standardizing complex commercial contracts and managing relations with the North African merchants who controlled the salt trade.
So in the cities, the Mansa is the pious, orthodox defender of the faith. He funds mosques and debates with scholars.
But when dealing with the rural provinces, the Mansa maintained his traditional role. To the farmers, he was the ultimate protector of the land. He was heavily involved in the propitiation of the traditional spiritual forces, the nyama that guaranteed a successful harvest and a bountiful yield from the gold shafts.
The sources even mention that during grand court ceremonies in the capital, Musa would sit on a raised dais. On one side, he would be flanked by Orthodox Islamic clerics reciting the Quran. And on the other side, he would be flanked by the traditional griots and animist advisors wearing amulets.
He is visually bridging two completely different worldviews to maintain national cohesion.
Mansa Musa's reign marks the absolute zenith of the Mali Empire. It was territorially vast, economically dominant, and culturally vibrant. However, the very mechanisms that allowed it to rapidly expand and accumulate such immense wealth contained structural flaws.
Flaws that, once exposed, initiated a slow, agonizing unraveling over the next few centuries.
And that unraveling begins at the very top, with a fundamental flaw in how power was transferred. The Mali Empire lacked a strict, universally enforced rule of primogeniture.
Primogeniture being the automatic, unquestioned inheritance of the throne by the monarch's eldest son. It provides absolute clarity, even if the son is incompetent.
Right, but Mandinka customary law prioritized a different metric: competence and consensus among the ruling elite. When Mansa died, the throne didn't automatically go to the eldest son. Brothers, cousins, and nephews could all legitimately claim the right to rule if they could prove they were the strongest candidate.
In theory, this system ensures that only the most capable, battle-tested leader assumes the throne. In practice, however, it guarantees that almost every single transition of power is violently contested.
And we see this play out disastrously. After the death of Mansa Suleiman in 1360, who was Mansa Musa's brother and a highly effective ruler in his own right, the oral traditions describe the subsequent era as a time of kings devouring kings.
The succession disputes became prolonged civil wars. Competing royal claimants would bribe different provincial governors for support, and heavily armed factions of the military would turn on each other.
Which is incredibly destructive.
These internal conflicts drained the royal treasury, decimated the elite cavalry reserves, and critically, completely distracted the central government in Niani from securing the external borders.
And in a geopolitical landscape entirely dependent on controlling trade routes, if the central authority shows weakness, the periphery will instantly exploit it. The external pressures mount rapidly. To the north, the Tuareg nomads, who had always controlled the deep Saharan routes, recognize that the Malian cavalry is bogged down in civil war. Around 1433, they push violently south and capture the city of Timbuktu.
Losing Timbuktu was an economic catastrophe. It severed the central Malian government's direct control over the northern salt trade and the lucrative taxation of goods moving across the Niger Bend. Simultaneously, the empire faced aggressive, sustained raids from the Mossi people pushing up from the south, ravaging the agricultural base.
But the truly fatal blow comes from within their own sphere of influence. A former vassal state decides to break away. The Songhai, centered around the eastern trading hub of Gao, assert their independence and immediately begin aggressively expanding at Mali's expense.
The rise of the Songhai Empire effectively dismantles Mali's eastern dominance. Under the brilliant and ruthless military leadership of Sunni Ali, the Songhai forces march on the Niger Bend. In 1468, Sunni Ali expels the Tuareg and captures Timbuktu for himself. By 1473, he besieges and conquers the vital commercial and intellectual hub of Djenné.
So in a span of a few decades, Mali is systematically stripped of its primary economic engines. Gao, Timbuktu, and Djenné are gone. The massive trans-Saharan wealth that previously funded the Malian armies is now flowing directly into the treasury of the Songhai.
And this devastating internal collapse happens to coincide with a fundamental, permanent shift in global trade dynamics. By the mid to late 15th century, Portuguese caravels begin dropping anchor on the West African coast.
This completely rewrites the economic map. For centuries, the absolute only way to export West African gold to the broader world was to send it north, across the brutal Sahara, straight through Mali's taxation toll booths. But suddenly, the Portuguese opened a direct maritime route to the south and west.
The center of economic gravity violently shifts. Trade begins pulling away from the interior trans-Saharan networks, moving toward the Atlantic coastal ports where European ships offer direct access to new goods, bypassing the Saharan middlemen entirely.
Mali, which is increasingly confined to its landlocked interior Mandan heartland, loses its geographic leverage. It can no longer dictate the terms of trade.
The final death throes of the empire stretch out over another century of slow contraction. The geopolitical landscape shifts one last time when the Saadi Sultanate of Morocco launches a daring invasion across the Sahara in 1591, completely destroying the Songhai Empire with the use of early firearms.
Watching their great rival collapse under Moroccan fire, the remaining Malian leadership attempts one desperate resurgence. In 1599, Mansa Musa IV rallies his remaining forces and attempts to recapture the city of Djenné from the Moroccan garrison.
It was a highly calculated risk that ended in total disaster. Mahmud's forces were repelled, facing concentrated volley fire from the Moroccan musketeers. Furthermore, the assault collapsed because a local provincial governor who had explicitly promised to support Mahmud with troops betrayed him at the last moment.
Mahmud IV survives the battle and retreats to Niani, but his political prestige is completely shattered. Following his death around 1610, his sons refuse to compromise. They violently fight over the few remaining fragments of the Mandan core. No single Mansa ever manages to rule the unified territory again. The massive empire finally splinters back into the small independent chiefdoms it started as centuries earlier.
When you analyze the vast arc of this collapse, it reveals a harsh, enduring reality about the nature of statecraft.
It is a deeply tragic irony. Think back to the Karuk and Fuga and the system Sundiata built, the segmentary federation. The decentralized, semi-autonomous provincial system is exactly the mechanism that allowed Sundiata to build the empire so rapidly. He co-opted the local kings instead of fighting 20-year wars of occupation.
He prioritized rapid integration over absolute assimilation. But that very same mechanism meant that the provincial territories retained their distinct ethnic identities, their own local military structures, and their own regional leaders. The moment the central Mansa in Niani showed systemic weakness or drained the treasury fighting his own brothers, those provincial governors possessed the intact administrative apparatus to simply walk away and declare themselves independent. Empires frequently fracture along the exact same fault lines they utilized to assemble themselves.
The political borders of the Mali Empire completely dissolved. But to look at a map and say the empire vanished would be highly inaccurate. The cultural and legal shockwaves of what they built survived the political collapse by centuries.
The legacy is profoundly embedded in West Africa. The Mande language group spread rapidly due to the empire's economic and military expansion, and it remains a major lingua franca across the region today. The complex legal principles of social harmony and dispute resolution established at the Kurukan Fuga continue to influence regional concepts of justice long after the Mansas lost their power.
And critically, the history itself survived intact. The lineage of the Jelly, the Griots, continued their hereditary duty. They kept memorizing, reciting, and passing down the Epic of Sundiata, the laws of the Kurukan Fuga, and the mechanics of the empire across 800 years of political upheaval. Which brings us right back to where we started, to the idea of the blueprint.
We currently live in a paradigm where we trust the written word and the digital archive implicitly. We assume our history is permanent simply because we can point to the data stored on a server farm. But the history of the Mali Empire demonstrates the staggering resilience of a society whose deepest histories, complex constitutional laws, and social contracts were safeguarded and transmitted almost entirely through the disciplined spoken word.
It leaves you with a deeply compelling question. If our digital records, our massive servers, and our written archives simply vanish tomorrow, if our digital records simply vanish tomorrow, what stories, what laws, and what foundational truths would we actually be able to pass down to the next generation purely from memory? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.